Well, my talk will fit with all of the others, I think. And note, I updated my title somewhat to reflect the narrower focus I'm taking with some of my revisions on this paper. So now it's The Gender Gap in Business Leadership, Exploring the Role of Identity Redefinitions After Gender Norm Violations. Women are significantly underrepresented in positions of power in corporations. For example, within Fortune 500 companies, right now they occupy only about 6% of the CEO positions and only about 25% of the executive and managerial positions. Numerous studies have identified discriminatory processes and other kinds of processes that contribute to this gap. But in the interest of time, I'll simply acknowledge this work and not review it. But despite this extensive scholarship, questions remain about the micro-level interactional foundations of this gender gap. So my co-author, Trent, Cason, and I seek to address that by focusing on two questions and using ACT and Interact to answer them. So first, we hypothesize that female executives will violate gender norms in a wider range of executive normative events than will male executives. And second, we examine how these gender norm violations alter the way that people view those gender norm violators, and hypothesize that observers' deflection, reducing redefinitions of gender deviant executives will produce transient identities that are further from the affective meaning of executive for female executives than they are for male executives. Now, other theoretical and empirical pieces have examined this first hypothesis, showing that indeed women who are in positions of power or leadership are more vulnerable to gender norm violations. But not as much work has focused on the second question, and that's, what are the redefinitions that follow those gender norm violations? So our work builds on the existing work in this area by exploring an additional mechanism that may contribute to that gap, the identity redefinitions that follow gender norm violations. And we also hope to develop an approach that could be used to examine other kinds of inequalities beyond gender or gender in this context. And we see our approach is especially useful for conceptualizing components of the doing gender perspective and some of the other doing perspectives, such as doing class and doing age. So I'll quickly move on to my sample. So our study is based in part on an analysis of 520 events, and we created this sample by combining three values, -2, 0, and 2, in all possible ways to create 27 EPA profiles for both the behavior and the object. And then we used Interact, the 01 to 03 US dictionary, to identify 5 business-related concepts that were close to each one of those 27 profiles. And those profiles are listed in the appendix on the left-hand side, and the appendix is at the end of your handout. The appendix shows you our sample, our creation of our sample. So in the final step, we selected from that pool the behavior and object EPA profiles that were normative for an executive, and we classified them as normative using 2 criteria. First, the profile had to be within a Euclidean distance of 1 from at least one business-related behavior or identity in one of the 2 dictionaries, the female or the male. So if you see a cell in the appendix with nothing in it, there was no concept within a Euclidean distance of 1 to that profile. And then the 5 closest concepts within a Euclidean distance of 1 had to be fairly normative for an executive in the form of a behavior or an object. And Trent and I coded that criterion using, in part, our cultural knowledge, but also reviewing and drawing on ethnographies of managerial positions and executive dynamics and also some work by business researchers to try to identify what would seem to be normative for an executive. We selected, in the end, 13 behavior profiles and 10 object profiles, which we crossed to create 130 behavior object combinations. So in the appendix, those that are italicized are in cells for profiles that were included in the sample. We then simulated those 130 behavior object combinations with both a female executive as the actor and a male executive as the actor in both dictionaries, giving us data on 520 events. But each case in our data set is a behavior object combination, and the deflection scores are just variables that describe those combinations. So our data set is 260 cases. Okay, so now I'll explain how we operationalize our gender concepts. So we propose creating a score for gender norm violations by comparing the deflection from simulations with gender modified or gendered actors, such as a female executive and a male executive, directing the same behavior at the same object, such as a female executive blames an employee and a male executive blames an employee. So the only thing that differs between those two events is the gender of the actor. So, you know, any difference in the deflection can be attributed to gender. And we use a deflection difference of 0.5 as the cutoff for classifying an event as gender deviant for the actor. And we subtract the male deflection score from the female deflection score. So events with a deflection difference equal to or greater than 0.5 are gender deviant for females. And those that are equal to or smaller than negative 0.5 are gender deviant for males. We classify an event as gender neutral if the absolute difference in the deflection score between, you know, two comparable events with just a different gender for each actor as gender neutral if the absolute difference is less than 0.5. And we define doing gender events as those that fulfill two criteria. First, the event would be gender deviant if enacted by a parallel actor of the other gender. And second, the event is fairly normative for the actor, and we define actor normative as events that generate less than 2 for the actor deflection score. So then 2 sets of simulations should help illustrate these operationalizations. So when a female executive commands an employee, the actor-based deflection is 3.39. But when a male executive does this same thing, the deflection is only 0.73, the actor deflection. And when a female executive cheats an employee, the deflection score for the actor is humongous, 14.37, right? And then when a male executive does this, it's only 4.46. So both events are gender deviant for females. So both events fulfill the first criterion for classifying the events as doing gender for males. But only the first event generates an actor-based deflection that's under 2. So only the first one would qualify with our operationalizations as doing gender for the males. Okay, so before I present the results, I'll just quickly show you the EPA profiles for the actors in all of our simulations. These are also in Table 1. In Table 1 in your handout, I also give you the Euclidean distance between these identities and the EPA of an executive. And note that the distance is actually smaller for a female executive than male executive in the female dictionary. And that will provide an interesting base of comparison, I think, when we move on to some of my later results. Okay, so according to our first hypothesis, recall, we expect female executives to violate gender norms in a wider range of executive normative situations. So we assessed this in two different ways. First, we computed the proportion of events in our sample that were gender deviant for females and gender deviant for males. These results are found in the second column of tables 2 and 3. Table 2 has the data from the female dictionary, table 3 the male dictionary. So the results from the female dictionary are intuitive and match our expectations and show that 69% of the events are gender deviant for females and 25% are gender deviant for males. But contrary to hypothesis 1, the results from the male dictionary show that only 22% of the events are gender deviant for females, while 38% are gender deviant for male executives. But when we combine the dictionary, the two dictionaries, we see a pattern in line with predictions: 45% gender deviant for female executives and 31% gender deviant for male executives. So this assessment provides some support for our hypothesis, but not uniform support. All right, so our sample of events created by combining these three numbers in all possible ways could include some uncommon events and could miss some very common events that executives may face. So we have another way of assessing this hypothesis, and that involves looking at events that are highly likely. So we use Interact to generate a sample of workplace events that are highly likely, and that is those that minimize the overall deflection. We generate deflection minimizing behaviors for a female and a male executive interacting with 7 objects in each dictionary, and that creates 14 pairs of events per dictionary. And in these events, the female and male executives are interacting with the same object, and both are generating the deflection minimizing behavior. So you can see these results in tables 4 and 5. My clicker is suddenly not working. Or you can study tables 4 and 5.
I wanted to jump out of that occasionally. So. That's right. There we go.
Okay. There we go.
But it just keeps repeating.
So here's just a big overview, and I'll later walk you through the table a little bit. So none of the male executives' deflection minimizing actions are gender deviant, whereas 3 of the female executives' deflection minimizing events are gender deviant. So we selected objects that had varied evaluation and potency scores. So that was sort of the strategy with that. But we didn't have a real system beyond that for selecting these. And I'll note that the cases wherein the females were unable to, generate something that confirmed their identity or stay in the neutral zone were those where they were interacting with an opponent, an unreliable employee, and a foolish manager. So this is part of table 4. This is the unreliable employee component. It's toward the bottom of table 4. So the results show that females, remember these are the data from the females, expect a female executive to direct actions such as confront or bargain with toward an unreliable employee, and that this generates 1.72 on the actor-based deflection score. This is the deflection minimizing action. If a male executive does the same thing, he generates only 0.4 for actor-based deflection. And then the row below that shows what the deflection minimizing action would be for the male executive, and this is lower on evaluation and higher on potency and higher on activity, and a word that would be close to that profile is penalize. And then you see his deflection score is 0.3. And if the female executive were to enact that action, it would be an actor-based deflection score of 2.46. So we can use these numbers to compute the differences in deflection and then classify the events according to our concepts. And both of the concepts would do gender for female or for males and be deviant for females. Okay. So these results suggest that if male executives simply behave in expected ways, they're likely to avoid gender deviance. But if female executives behave in expected ways, displays of gender deviance are unavoidable when they're interacting with negatively evaluated objects. Okay, so moving on to hypothesis 2. So recall that our second hypothesis is that we expect observers' redefinitions of female executives after a gender deviant event to be further from the affective meaning of an executive for the female executives and the male executives. We find complete support for this hypothesis, and the results are in tables 2 and 3. So these tables list the mean EPA profiles for behaviors and objects at different levels of gender deviance. The redefinitions column lists the EPA profiles for actor attributes that could reduce the deflection of the event in that row. So I simulated the event in that row. I took the average behavior EPA, average object EPA for that part of the sample, and then simulated that event and determined what the actor attributes would be to reduce the deflection. I used both a new attribute that would be added on top of the female or male, and then also used the approach of getting an additional one, new and additional. So I did both routes. And the results are somewhat similar. So we assess hypothesis 2 by observing the last two columns. These columns list the Euclidean distance between the EPA of the transient identity created by adding that attribute, if it's the additional attribute, or replacing female or male with that new attribute profile, and the executive identity. And I use the executive profile that's from that same dictionary. I don't list the transient identities in the table, but of course I have them if you want to see them. It was just too much information to get into one table. So the first row shows that if a female executive directs an action such as chide at an object such as a merchant, observers can make sense of her gender deviance by giving her an additional attribute such as petty or immoral. And then that new transient identity has a Euclidean distance of 3.16 from the EPA of an executive. But as shown at the bottom of that table, the same type of actor redefinition for an equally gender deviant male executive produces a transient identity with the Euclidean distance of only 1.82 from the EPA of an executive. And then similar patterns are found at higher levels of gender deviance as you move down on table 4, and then similar patterns are also found in table 5, where I present the data from the male dictionary. So in total, we generated 10 sets of comparable female and male redefinitions, the same types of redefinitions at the same level of gender deviance, and all 10 were consistent with hypothesis 2. So these numbers represent Euclidean distances. So together, these findings suggest how cultural meanings tied to gendered identities create interactional events that contribute to the gender gap in women's leadership. Female executives violate gender norms in a wider range of situations, and observers' reactions to those violations are likely to be more detrimental for female executives than they are to male executives. This also highlights something that is clear in the literature on females and leaders, and that's that women are in a bind. If they enact the needed behaviors, perceptions may impair their success. But if they don't, they may be perceived as ill-suited to a leadership position because they're not fulfilling the requirements of their position. Second, we see our work as perhaps a model that could be used to understand interactional processes underlying other kinds of inequities, other kinds of gender gaps, and other kinds of forms of inequality, such as class or race or sexual orientation. That, I'm done.